Aloha, everybody. My name is Rob Hack. I'm on the board of directors of the Hawaii Pacific Export Council, and we are starting a new series at HPEC on doing business in China. And this is our first event, a kickoff, if you will, and we've put together a preeminent group of speakers and panelists today who will discuss their experiences of doing business in China. Before we get going with that, though, Mark Ritchie from DBET has joined us, and he'd like to say a few words about the High Step program, of which we do a lot of work and consider DBET a critical partner. So, Mark, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Seems like a great kickoff webinar to do. I just came on, just wanted to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about our High Step program, which is the Hawaii Trade Expansion State Trade Expansion Program, and that is based on a grant that we received from the Small Business Administration. And DBED, along with our resource partners such as HPEC, we designed a very comprehensive program to assist kind of a complete continuum of companies, from very new to export type companies that are just looking at starting an export program to much more experienced exporters. And the High Step program has basically 3 components. The first component is webinars, seminars, and this one actually isn't in the official High Step program, but there's similar programs that we do to cover all facets of exporting, from specific countries to logistics and other export-related topics. And then also we do one-on-one business consulting, working with companies and trying to find out what their needs are and how our program can assist them. The second component is where we take Hawaii pavilions out at trade shows across the world and put a group of Hawaii companies together that basically turnkey for them, and it's a greatly subsidized or reduced cost for them to go into a trade show. An upcoming trade show, for instance, is the Tokyo International Gift Show. We take over 50 companies into that show every year. Past couple of years, it's been done remotely, but we will be going in person this next round here in the fall. And then lastly, the last component is we have individual company assistance available to help companies that are not going into these pavilions but need help with various costs associated with exporting. Everything from travel, taking out trade show booths, to signing up doing Gold Key through the Foreign Commercial Service, and a lot of other sort of costs can be picked up. This year, we've funded companies up to $15,000 a piece for them to go into their trade shows, but also just travel and sales calls and things. I think if you'd like to go to our website, it's invest.hawaii.gov, and then pull down on the toolbar the exporting link, and it'll explain the program and how to sign up and be a part of it. So thank you very much, Rob. Back to you. And by the way, my name is, again, it's Mark Ritchie. I'm a branch chief at DBET. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or my colleague, Jamie Lung. Thank you, Rob.
Great. Thank you, Mark, and thank you again for all the cooperation that we have with DBET. We really appreciate that. Before we move on, I wanted to very quickly show our YouTube archive. Maybe I'll jump to that at the end then. We have a YouTube archive of these events that we've recorded and posted to YouTube. And if you just go to YouTube and search for the Hawaii Pacific Export Council, you'll see nearly 100 videos, of which this will be one in about a week from now. So please have a look at that fantastic archive. Now, before we move further, I'd like to just quickly announce that we're also doing a new program later this year in August and September called an Export Plan Writing Workshop, where we're helping companies one-on-one write export plans that can be used for applying for SBA loans or for the DBET assistance through High Step. So please look for announcements for those. I think that that's a really exciting program that our local companies can benefit from. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into our China program. I'm really excited to have put together this panel of local experts here in Hawaii who have tremendous experience with the China market. First off, we have Bill Zarrett, Richard Xie, Brenda Foster, Larry Foster, and then myself, Rob Hack. Bill Zarrett is a senior counselor with the Cohen Group. He's a longtime China hack, has a lot of experience there, decades of experience, I think we can safely say, and he's been gracious enough to come and speak with us today about his experiences in China. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Rob. How's the sound? We can all hear each other. Very good. Again, thanks, Rob, and thank you also to Dale Wright, an old friend and colleague who helped us put this together. And it is so terrific to see old friends. And we've got DJ Halcrow, who we've worked together for a long time, and the Fosters, who actually are an icon in U.S.-China business. And I'll tell you something, you're not in China anymore, and look what happened to the relationship since you left. It's pretty rough. I want to also share that I'm spending my 50th anniversary of my first visit to Hawaii. One of the reasons I'm here, enjoying Hawaii, beautiful Hawaii. I started out here 50 years ago as a tour director. Just a little bit about where I came from here. Started out in Taiwan in the 70s as a student. Early 80s, I worked with the first IBM PC dealer in China. When China was China, or it was the China then. I worked with the Foreign Commercial Service for over 20 years, many of those in China. After leaving the Foreign Commercial Service, still working as a consultant with the Cohen Group based in Washington, D.C., the chair of which is former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen. And we serve American and European clients doing business in China. Also, I'm very active in the American Chamber, mostly active in the one based in Beijing, but also getting more and more involved in the chamber based in Shanghai. Both organizations very active and very strong. So this is about 45 years I've been at this game, and one of these days I'll get it right. When I'm not in China, I'm usually in Washington, D.C. Now, I just returned from a trip to China last month. I was there for 5 months. It's kind of tough getting in, getting a visa, going through quarantine, and then experiencing what's going on the ground. We can talk about that if anyone wants to. But I survived it, and we're expecting, my wife Cindy and I are expecting to go back to China late August, early September, if the COVID policies have moderated some and they're not 5-week quarantines and crazy things like this. But as I mentioned, I'm mostly in DC when I'm in the States, a little less than half the year. So my focus, to a great extent, is what's going on in the Beltway. And while in DC, I have a lot of opportunity to talk to old friends, contacts, and the like. And a theme that has come up a lot in the last 6 months to a year is that the U.S. seems to lack a China policy. But as one of my contacts there said, well, you just look what's going on all around China with U.S. policy, and that's America's China policy. So I would like to talk about the recent speech by Secretary Blinken, where he laid out officially America's China policy. But before that, I think it's interesting to look at what has been going on that involves China with U.S. policy. And I know that most of us here today are really focused on business, on a lot of us exporting to China, some of us importing from China. So this is maybe a little bit 20,000 foot view, but I think it's very important to help us understand where we all might be going with U.S. China policy. First of all, there's the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Now, the Quad is made up of Japan, U.S., Australia, and India. You don't see China in there, but you see a lot of countries around China. This Quad was actually created in 2004. You remember when we had the big tsunami? And the original reason for the Quad was humanitarian help. And after that, the Quad kind of lay dormant until 2017. You remember when President Trump came in and started the more aggressive policies towards China. The leaders of these four nations just met recently, and this was a very significant step. Now, of course, they're talking about their work on fighting the pandemic, but I think most significant for our purposes is that they agreed on a joint satellite monitoring system to monitor ships in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Islands, ships that have not turned on their identification systems. So they're trying to be under the radar. And the idea is to deter illegal fishing and maritime militia. Now, China is not explicitly mentioned, but we all know it's about the so-called fishing vessels that are all over the Indian Ocean and Pacific Islands. So this is what we see with the Quad. So that's one of the things going on around China and going into U.S. policy. Then there's AUKUS, Australia, the UK, and the US, which is a security alliance, started in 2021, and it is in part a response to let's just call it the China challenge, which is actually just China growing, being strong, doing what China does in its own interest. Just for a short way of talking about it, the China challenge to U.S. policymakers. And this AUKUS is for cooperation in a lot of military areas: cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, undersea, hypersonic, electronic warfare. So that's going on as well. Then we've got the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. The acronym is TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, US-EU, which is transatlantic cooperation for trade and technology, again, security. So to show the importance of this, a recent meeting there in Europe, Secretary Blinken, Commerce Secretary Raimondo, and United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai all attended on behalf of the U.S. So it's very, very high focus for the U.S. And again, China was not explicitly mentioned. There was more of a focus on Russia, However, when you look to see what they talked about, you can see that China is a subtext talking about semiconductor supply chains, talking about data governance, competitiveness, technology misuse affecting human rights. Ding, 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 ding. So these are all having to do also with the U.S. and China policy. And I think one that may have hit all of your radars is the very new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And I guess the U.S. government is calling it IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It officially launched on my birthday. It may be a coincidence, I'm not sure. May 23rd this year in Tokyo, where President Biden was there to launch this program. And the idea is to reassert U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific, as we used to call it, the Asia-Pacific. So in the Indo-Pacific, and provide U.S.-led alternative to China. Now, we all remember the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, that the U.S. helped to organize and then did not sign. Well, now there's a comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, and all the other members have signed on except the U.S., and it doesn't look like the U.S. is going in that direction at all. The politics in the U.S. really will not allow it on either side of the aisle. Multilateral treaties, trade treaties, are really not very popular now in the Beltway. This IPEF, basic themes are fair trade and sustainability and the need for robust digital democracy. You see there are similar themes running through all of these different activities that are going on related to U.S. policy in China. And let me just explain a little bit about this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because it's not necessarily intuitive, and I had to dig into it to try to get my head around it. There are 4 pillars, we call them. I guess we can call them buckets, you call them whatever you want to call them, but 4 areas of focus. One is fair and resilient trade. Okay, what does that mean? Well, they're talking about labor issues, they're talking about digital economy, they're talking about competition policy, good regulatory practices, things like that. So that's fair and resilient trade, that's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is resilient economy, which is equal to supply chain. The third bucket is clean economy, infrastructure, clean energy, decarbonization. The fourth bucket is fair economy. So we have fair and resilient trade, resilient economy, clean economy, fair economy. And that is, fair economy is focused on tax and anti-corruption issues. So the members that sign on to this IPEF can choose 1, 2, 3, or all of these buckets to participate in. And the deal is, if a country is participating in any one of these buckets, that country has to abide by all the regulations. There are no carve-outs, and so forth. Now, there have been 12 other countries that have signed up to negotiate this. So that makes 13. I'm not sure if that is a good omen or not. But 13 countries, now 7 from ASEAN, and then Japan, Korea, Australia, India. And you'll notice there's no Taiwan, and there are no Pacific islands involved in IPEF. As I mentioned, international trade is very controversial in the Beltway, more so maybe than it has been in years, and we don't get to see much agreement between the two parties. And as I said, multilateral trade agreements are not fashionable these days. So the Biden administration decided, well, what can we do to reassert ourselves out there without an actual treaty? Well, this IPEF does not require congressional approval. It's an executive agreement. And yes, looking at what the requirements are for each country, they're certainly not as high a bar as we've seen in other multilateral trade agreements. But I think that the Biden administration was actually looking for more participation with this. The organizers expect that by the time HPEC meets in November in the US, November 2023, that this IPEF will have negotiated all of the negotiations that are going on, and we'll know who is involved in what pillar and so forth. Now, let's see, just a few of the things going on in Congress specifically, which we find of interest that are directly related to U.S.-China relations. And that is, the first one is the Bipartisan Innovation Act, which is purported to strengthen supply chains and revitalize U.S. manufacturing. Now, this has been talked about in both houses of Congress. The House came out with a Competes Act, and the Senate version was the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. And we're expecting that they will come together in this Bipartisan Innovation Act, and hopefully by the end of August, we will have something that the focus of which really is American competitiveness, and again, very much focused on competing successfully with China. I guess the other, one part of this, let me just go back for a moment, it might be an outbound investment review requirement. Now, we haven't had this in the U.S. We've had the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, which reviews investments of foreign companies in American companies where there are some national security issues that could possibly be important. In this case, we're talking about reviewing U.S. investment in other countries for similar reason, national security, want to protect American technology and so forth. Now, this is highly controversial in the business, in industry, because this is going to slow things down quite a bit. And it is not universally accepted within government. I know that Secretary of Commerce Raimondo is a strong supporter of this, but folks like Janet Yellen in the Treasury and others who are more supportive of business really do not think that this is a necessary step. Anyhow, we should be able to see the result of this debate in the Bipartisan Innovation Act. One other act I'd like to point out, and again, you know, I'm going through a lot of these things, and a lot of these things you already know about, and I apologize if you do. But I did want to share these things because this is really top of mind for me as I'm talking to American companies that are already active in China and are trying to figure out, oh, what do we do? This other act is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And this is an act that requires American importers to somehow prove a negative, and that is to prove that there is no input in the products that they're importing from China that were from Xinjiang forced labor. So you can see it's a very difficult thing for a lot of companies to prove. Now, originally, they were talking about having companies self-review and to make statements to say that we know that this is the case and so forth. I don't know what we're going to do on June 21st when this act comes into force. The Customs and Border Patrol are enforcing this act, and I think we're going to have a lot of chaos that is related to this act. Of course, the idea is to not support or challenge what China is doing in Xinjiang with forced labor camps. Okay, now, indulge me, and I appreciate your indulgence here, but I do want to talk a bit about the big speech that Secretary Blinken made on the 26th of May, which is the much awaited and long delayed China policy for the U.S. And in the first paragraph, I noticed it was, I found the speech very comprehensive, very political, which you would expect. But in the first paragraph, I noted 5 or 6 items here of the theme of our policy. One is relying more on diplomacy. And I think that that is speaking to the last administration, which relied more on the hammer, on tariffs, and more aggressive behavior rather than diplomacy. Another theme is technology, to uplift rather than suppress. And I think this is directly speaking to China's surveillance, which is increasing. And I'll tell you, in the 2 years I was gone during the pandemic and went back to China, I noticed an increase in surveillance. And I think it's also speaking to the surveillance that some 80 countries use, Chinese equipment, to surveil their populations. Another theme is to support workers. Well, of course, this is traditionally something that the Democrats claim to do, and I think that in the last administration that the Trump administration was able to show at least verbally more support for workers. Respect for human rights, Xinjiang, and actually not just Xinjiang in China, but a lot of other issues where people are not allowed to speak freely, and if they do speak and say something that the party does not appreciate, then they have problems. The free movement of people and capital, and I think this we can see simply put is speaking to the governance of the Chinese Communist Party and how one of the goals of the party is to control. And the sixth theme, this is in the first paragraph of this speech, so it really goes right to the heart of things, talking about working in common cause. And again, this is with allies. And we saw that in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, in the Quad, in the AUKUS, in that US, EU, TTC, and we also see it in NATO, obviously. One sentence that I picked out of this speech is definitely worth focusing on, and that is that Blinken said China is the most serious long-term threat to international order. That's a pretty serious statement. The idea being that the international order set up after World War II has kept the world fairly on an even keel for these many years. And what is so ironic is that this system has helped China build its economy. There's no question that this system has been beneficial to China. And yet the sense is that China now does not really want to abide by these rules, thinks that, these rules were made by America, and the West with a focus on their benefit. And so this is what we see. We see a tug of war here. And the reason that Blinken says that that China is the most serious long-term threat to international order is because of this intent of China to revise some of these rules to be more to the benefit of China and perhaps of some other countries. But also, not just the intent, but the economic power, the diplomatic power, the military power, and the technological power. We have kind of for lack of a better word, I guess, a perfect storm here. And, the U.S. policymakers are well aware of this. One statement in there, which I was happy to see, is that, yes, we have to deal with each other. And sometimes you think, when you hear especially senators or representatives lashing out at China, that, we're just going to not work with China at all. Well, that is not realistic. And the fact that we know that we have to work with China, I think, to me, is certainly positive. And the fact that in the speech also, Blinken said, China's not going to change on its own. China's not going to change its trajectory. It's been pretty successful over these many years. So we just have to have a strategy that will help us to succeed in this environment. And so they've come up with, three really pithy, that's with a TH, three pithy concepts. And that would be invest, align, and compete. Okay, invest in research, infrastructure, education, in order to be more competitive, more innovative, and to help strengthen our democracy. So that's invest. Then you've got align. Well, we've talked about this, align with allies, which is, as we all know, very different from the former administration, which did not focus on aligning with U.S. allies, but was really more or less going it alone against China. And compete, I think we have a good idea in the areas that we need to compete, all kinds of areas, technology, and as it relates to civil society, as it relates to the military, just strengthening our country. Now, Taiwan seems to always be somewhere in our thought when we're talking about China. And according to this speech, there's been no policy change on Taiwan. Okay, really? First of all, and this is my personal editorializing right now, when I see that, well, China is becoming so much more aggressive about Taiwan with the overflights of military aircraft and other aggressive activity, I think sometimes people forget what the U.S. has been doing lately. When the Trump administration came in and had a phone call with Tsai Ing-wen, that really kind of upset the apple cart. And military sales has been an issue all through our relationship with Taiwan since '79, Taiwan-China-U.S. relationship. But there have been a lot of visits by high-level government officials, U.S. officials. There has been the rhetoric, especially from the last administration, about Taiwan, defending Taiwan, regime change from Secretary of State Pompeo. And more recently, I think we haven't missed that President Biden says, yeah, well, if Taiwan attacks, or if mainland China attacks Taiwan, we're going to get involved. And so trying to say that there's no change in policy, to me, is kind of hard to believe. We've been, since 1979, we've had this policy of strategic ambiguity. We agree that there's one China, okay? and that we also agree, or that we expect a peaceful resolution of the differences between China and mainland China, Taiwan and mainland China. So this strategic ambiguity seems to have worked. But I think now we're coming into a time when perhaps the U.S. does need to be clearer about what it would do if there were an attempted military takeover by mainland China of Taiwan. Why? Because what we're seeing with the present leadership in China, that it is very forward-leaning, it is getting impatient, and that under the present leadership, there is a desire to see Taiwan come into the warm embrace of the mainland under this leadership's tenure. So it is, again, it's a tug of war going on. Also in the speech, cooperation. There are areas where we can and should cooperate with China. And there is a focus in this strategy to do whatever we can to do that. Global warming, pandemic, nuclear non-proliferation, illegal narcotics, global food crises, things like that. Also, we learned that the State Department has set up a special bureau. They call it the China House. Now, I don't know where that came from. But the China House to coordinate and implement this strategy across the executive branch and with Congress. So, you know, I think it's good that we've got a little clearer idea what the strategy is. Some of the criticisms that we've been hearing from folks, especially involved in business, is that, you know, it looks like we're not going to join CPTPP, and it's a big disappointment to so many of us, but the handwriting was on the wall. Nothing about tariff reductions, and of course there's a tug of war going on in the executive branch between Department of Commerce especially and Treasury. And on the side of the Treasury is USTR about tariffs with China, and also about better market access. There's really no discussion on that. Now, quickly, let's see how we're doing. As I said, I was in China for 5 months, got back in April, and I've been very active in the American Chambers of Commerce in China. The one based in Beijing, I was chair 2017, 2018. So I got to deal with the Trump administration. That was fun. I'm still on the board of that AmCham. And the AmCham based in Beijing and the one based in Shanghai are working together better than they have for a while, which is a good thing. Very strong leadership on both sides. We get feedback from members through surveys, and a lot of it's through these flash surveys, we call them. They're on a certain topic, and we want a quick turnaround. So by the time that the numbers are collated, it's not out of date. A very recent one, which was done by a combination of the two chambers, talking about lockdowns, the effect of lockdowns on business. And 60% of the respondents, now there are over 1,000 member companies in Shanghai, fewer in Beijing, but 800, 900, whatever it is. And so if you get 25% of your membership to respond, that's pretty good. And these are just really gives us ideas. So we don't go into 62.37% of the companies, things like that. But about 60% of the companies are reducing their revenue projections for the year because of the lockdowns. These are the members of the chambers. 50% of the expatriates, expatriates are unlikely to relocate to China. So this is an American company that has leadership, which is usually an expatriate. Someone comes from headquarters. But half of the companies are unlikely to relocate these expats to China. And the main reason for that right now is the lockdowns, the procedures to get to China, the limitations on getting to China, the quarantines that are just over the top, even when you look at the science, and the difficulty in traveling both to China and around China. A question on supply chains. And the COVID had a negative effect on supply chains for 60% of the respondents. The EU chamber, which is very, very active in China and very forward-leaning, also did a flash survey after the lockdowns became such an issue. And 25% of their respondents said that current and planned investment is no longer going to take place, so that they're limiting investments. Some companies are waiting to see what happens. Other companies have just decided, no, we're not going to increase our investment or bring in new investment. And that percentage, it's 25%, 1 out of 4 companies. That percentage has doubled since January of this year. So you can see that these COVID policies that the Chinese leadership has put in place has had really long-term effect on doing business with China. So even after the COVID policies become a little more reasonable, and reasonable is my term, but I think they should be more reasonable, that there still will be a lasting effect, because who knows what the next crisis will be, where supply chains will be affected, travel will be affected, and so forth. Also in the EU Chamber survey, 80% of the respondents find that China is a less desirable, less attractive investment than it was in the beginning of the year. And that, like American companies, except even a higher percentage, 75% of the companies were adversely affected by lockdown, and 90% of the supply chains impacted. You know, what I would like to do is to just end with, and let's see if I can get to these notes. I've got these. If I don't have notes, I can't even remember my name. But yes, I think this is it. Just some activities that these chambers are doing, the American chambers are doing in China. This is both Beijing-based and Shanghai-based. We have an annual outreach visit to Washington, where issues that affect doing business in China, we bring these to the government folks, executive branch, Congress, think tanks, other influencers. Now, in the past, this would be an annual trip. We'd have about 20 companies come on the trip. It would be nonstop for a week. And we would tell our story and listen to what they had to say. Well, since the pandemic, we've done these online. And frankly, I think we've discovered that, you can't have the intimate conversation, you can't really read the body language as well, but it's a lot less wear and tear on the members of the outreach group. So we're starting these again in the next week or so, and the first meeting will be actually with the U.S. Chamber based in Washington. But in any event, every time we do this, we have to come up with a message. We have to come up with a succinct message. And as you can imagine, we've got, let's say we've got 900 members, and then we have 899 opinions on what that message should be. So this is a big process that we go through every year. And what I'd like to do is give you an idea what last year's talking points were. They'll be fairly similar. The type of issues that the membership, it's coalescing around the common denominator of what members are looking for. And our message, it's also interesting that we have to remember to whom we are speaking, because especially folks on the Hill, the executive branch, we know they have their agendas. And so if we come in and say, you know what, all of this national security nonsense is adversely affecting my business. Well, you'll have 30 seconds with these folks, and then, look at the hand. So we have to take this all into consideration in our message, but and we don't want to make it too long, because we sometimes have a half hour with these folks. So 5 points we had last year, I think they'll be similar this year. Prioritize U.S. domestic investment in education, science, and technology to have the U.S. more competitive. And that has been covered in some of the things we've talked about already, so I think that will resonate. Rebuild U.S.-China communication. You remember we had the Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade and the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. Well, those went the way of the collar button during the Trump administration, and frankly, I don't think that was a bad idea, because we were talking for years, spending money and resources and time, and making really only incremental progress. But what we now lack, because we don't have these dialogues, is the communication, the relationship building on the working level and at the higher levels. People are not communicating. And it's important that we bring some kind of results-oriented and focused communication back into the relationship and on an official level. So that's talking point 2. Talking point 3, coordinate with allies. And again, this is being done in spades with the Biden administration, so that will also resonate with these folks. And not only working with allies, but work with allies to make sure that we are advocating for market access, fair trade, like we've been doing for the last 30 years. The 4th talking point, and here's where we have to be nuanced. Apply national security actions reasonably, okay, to allow space for commercially focused engagement. And the 5th would be, I think, one that's near and dear to our hearts, is to restart people-to-people exchanges as soon as the pandemic will allow. So this is the message we bring, and we tend to get good meetings with these folks on the Hill and around Washington. I'm going to stop there, and if you have given me your attention, I'd like you to thank you for it. And if you haven't, I'd like you to thank you for not snoring loudly. And Rob, handing it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. That was a great overview of what's going on in China. We're going to shift gears and get a little more into the weeds on a specific issue with Richard Xie, who is the owner of So HSL Group. And Richard has been successful very recently exporting beef to China, and I thought he would be a great speaker today. And so please, Richard, tell us a little bit about HSL Group, you, and your experience with selling beef.
Great, I really appreciate for the opportunity. So my name is Richard Xie, and I was the 2009 SBA Hawaii State Exporter of the Year. And the last 25 years, I've been export tropical fish, seaweeds, shrimps, you name it. Most of the Hawaii Pacific Rims products I sell to, the peak time I sell to 27 countries. The last couple of years, just out of blues, and I get into the beef industry. I just want to give you some data that how great the industry is. 2021, direct to China export, beef export increased 346% in volumes and 413% in values. So reached to 1.59 billion. The grain-fed beef is only 11% of the whole China beef import. U.S. is the best supplier and provides 68% of the 11%. So this is our biggest share of the market. And 2022, the first quarter to 2021, export to China is up another 61.77%. And reached to 145 million pounds. And South Korea is number one, 208 million pounds. Japan, 185, and China is catching up for 145 million pounds just for a quarter. So U.S. beef in 2021 reached 10 billion, the first time in history. So, and about 20% is going to China and Hong Kong area. And then plus about 8% to Taiwan. So the whole China, Great China area is about 30% total. And then Japan's about 24.8, Korea is about 24.6%. So the whole Asia rim is about 60 to almost 70% of the U.S. beef export. Talking about my company is 2021 versus 2020, my sales up 300%. And the first quarter of the years versus 2022, versus 2021, we up 200%. So we think by the end of the year, we pretty much can up to 400% of the versus 2021. So it's a short period of time, so I can't talk too much, but I just some experience sharing. First one is the right products, because I involved in quite a bit products sell to China. Like just pick one example is one local chocolate factory, and we try to help them to sell to China. It was not a successful case. The reason is that Hawaii, definitely in US, the brand is kind of like a supreme. But in China, Switzerland is much more supreme brand than Hawaii. So, and then their price is way cheaper than Hawaii. So when we walk into Beijing and try to say, hey, Hawaii is the best brand, and it doesn't work, that way. So the right product is definitely very important. So I help Big Islands, some of the farms try to sell the avocados. They're too big. One is that because when it's too big, it's too costly for each food. So versus when we sell to the Mexicans, they're smaller, and then they look uglier, but the price wise and the size wise is more fit for the Chinese consumer. And pay attention to the details. The second point is that I deal with a lot of the Chinese have different cuts in our industry. Is the cuts, so the cuts are different. So we have to coordinates, try to explain to the slaughterhouse how the China want, and then a lot of the American slaughterhouse, and they get upset about it, and they say we are the best, So, but consumer is always right. So we're kind of like a bridging between try to let the American slaughterhouse owners and calm down, fully understand how the consumer works, and then the Chinese get upset too, and then they'll say, hey, why they don't listen to me, so anything like that. And then packaging, like here, we use brown boxes, and then think about it. I try to explain to American owners. I say, hey, we can use the brown boxes to package here, but in China, you think about it costs a lot for the shipping and everything, and when it reaches to the market, they want supreme package. So we have to repackage, rename it, and pick the colors, which is more the Chinese light colors. One extreme example, we deal with a ranch in Montana, and they intend to use green labels. And then, I know the green hats in Chinese is more like your wife have an affair with someone. So it's kind of like hard to explain, kind of like things like that. We try to tell them politely, how we can change the colors and then things like that. So it's just complicated to make the two culture branding to each other. Payment terms, and then I deal with a lot of private sectors, but but we're talking millions of dollars, and then in somehow the national company will involve. Right now, the Chinese national companies, they're very funny. They acting like private banking, so they're not into business, but they provide fund to private sectors, private enterprise to do bridging for them, and then they charge couple points in a month or two for the. So and that will be a rules involved. So they want to so because there's a national fund, government fund involved, and then they will require to sign direct contract with slaughterhouse, which is in U.S. is not the case, because the slaughterhouse in U.S. is more like it's just a custom kill area, but the Chinese buyers, especially these national entities, and they don't understand how the U.S. system works, so they insist they sign a direct contract with the slaughterhouse, which they don't even own the cattle, and they don't even own the meat. They just charge the slaughter fees. So it's a communication issues in there, and then and getting into the niche position, Chinese buyers, because it's a big market, it's a huge volumes, but their profit margin is super slim. So in a way, they always want to cut the middleman. I fully understand that part. And then so in order to survive, for me, for example, I involved in the cattle the last couple months, the feedlot part. I own the cattle. I take it to the slaughterhouse to kill it, and then I take it to the cold storage to breastfeeding, and then I take it to the ports to ship it. So I have to do the full portion of it, and also have to arrange for the truckings and trailers and everything. So you have to do the whole 9 yards to get your position, not try to get kicked out in the whole process. And then, of course, just got to find your right customer. I get calls all the times from Chinese customers. They want to give me like 200 containers a month, like all kind of things like that. But sometimes it doesn't work. It just, we have some beef jerky company in China, and then they say 100 container guarantee every month, but that kind of customer, that's not what I want, because they try to squeeze 2 pennies, And then our U.S. U.S. beef is on the upper hands on the extreme, super prime market segments. So I don't need to deal with that type of customer. So pick your right customer. That's my 5 points to share from my experience. And that's about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. That was great. We really appreciate your expertise on the China market. How long have you been working, did you say, with the China market?
I've been doing business in China for the last 25 years. Yeah.
Great. And that included tropical fish and other things?
Yes. And also, right now, I do bring in construction materials, robots from China. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. So this portion of the seminar, we have a panel discussion. It's just basically answering questions and some comments, and we're adding 2 more fantastic panelists here. Brenda Foster, who is, again, a longtime China hack, had spent a long time as executive director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and now she's president of Foster and Associates in Kailua. And then Larry Foster, related, he's professor emeritus and former dean at the law school at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So we welcome both of them here to talk more about China. There's a ton of questions, so I ask everybody to just be relatively brief in your responses so we can get as many opinions in as possible in the time that's allowed.
Rob, could I just make a few
Please.
basic points?
Please.
First of all, thank you, Rob, and I thank HPEC and also DBED. I think this is a great program to have. It's always fun to be back on a panel with Bill Zaret. We had a lot of fun in our China days, and I'm in awe of everything that Richard Xie is going through in doing business with China. And I really appreciate hearing the geopolitical tensions as well as what some of the COVID containment policies would be. But let me just go very quickly through just a couple bullet points, because I too would like to get to the questions and see if we might be able to help. But let me go back to what I would call basically 101 on terms of starting to think about doing business with China. And both Richard and Bill have touched on a few of them. But one of it is never make an assumption based on your success in other markets that you're going to be very successful in China. Just never make that assumption. Richard also highlighted what I think is critically important is the right product for China and the right market for China. China is not a single market. It's many markets, especially in the different provincial areas, the different local governments, the types of programs that they do and incentives they offer for SMEs. There's a lot of business to be had, I think, out in the provincial levels outside of Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Chengdu, or some of the business areas. So there are other markets, so look at what those local economies must be. Richard highlighted this over and over, and I'm going to stress it again. Ensure that the product you have is one that the Chinese want to buy, number one. And especially if you're in food and healthcare, that is food or beverage products, excuse me, that's very critical, especially for the health and safety standards. But also, if you are doing a product that isn't, say, a product that's in food or beverages, make sure that the product that you are sending has a competitive edge. In other words, it's not one that the Chinese can copy easily and sell at a lower price. And I know we have a lot of Hawaii companies that have just wonderful products for export, but just make sure that it's not one that the Chinese really can copy. Or if you have, say, a lower, what I'll call a lower complexity product, just make sure, again, it's not one they copy, and it's not one that the Chinese want to take on because they may assume it has lower profit margins. So I think that's equally as important. There's other areas, too, if you want to export to China, and you're hearing on some of the various business models. And let me just touch on those. One would be a distributor business model where distributor in China will buy and sell your products in China for you. That could have its own challenges, I'll say, because distributors at times have their own agendas as to what they may want. They may want exclusivity. That, again, could present a problem. But if you do go an exclusivity route, make sure that the conditions, the restrictions, the geography, the industry, the market segment, minimum sales volume, and the rest are all really spelled out legally, and I'll let Larry answer the legal questions and what that all entails. But definitely have legal advice on all of that. The other would be your e-commerce. You have two kinds of e-commerce. The cross-border e-commerce, which currently in China only accounts for, I think, 5% of the total e-commerce market in China. The other, and probably more popular, is domestic e-commerce in China. That's 95% of the market. But to do domestic e-commerce, you have to go through a Chinese subsidiary that's going to help you with that. But then you sell on the Chinese platform, say Taobao or whatever, and a friend of all of ours here around the table, Frank Lavin, also has a big e-commerce program that he works out with Taobao and others. But you also need, if you do domestic e-commerce, besides using a Chinese subsidiary, your product and everything will need to meet the local requirements to where you're going to be exporting that product to, or again, the local markets. And the local markets, personally, in my viewpoint, are where the real growth for a lot of products in China can come. Again, I'm talking about different kinds of export products. I'm not talking the heavy industries, the chemicals, the digital media, I mean, all of the other really high-end stuff that I know Bill has worked on for years and others. I'm not talking about those products. I'm talking about another market segment in China. The other way you could go to is a local office. I'm not so sure about that, but with a local office, you really are involved in all of the steps from bringing the products in. I'm listening to what Richard is talking about, having a local, if you have a local office. But what I would do would set up a WOFE, or a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, which you are there with China. You have, I think, more full control. You're dealing with Chinese laws and the rest, but you're going to do that anyway. It just depends on the other. And then the final one is a brick and mortar. Those tend to be the more luxury brands if they go brick and mortar, but I have noticed that, at least with regard to China, in brick and mortar companies or companies that establish brick and mortar tend to be a lot of luxury brands. But what they also put with that brick and mortar is a domestic e-commerce and sometimes a cross-border e-commerce platforms to go with those brick and mortars. It has been, at least the experience that I've had in China and working with a lot of companies, that success doesn't come easy. You're listening to Richard. I'm listening to Richard where he backed out and now he owns the cattle, he feeds the cattle, he ships the cattle, finds the transportation, and he handles the marketing, the branding, the packaging, the distribution, the whole logistics supply chain on top of it. It's not easy. Is it doable? Sure, it's doable if you've got the right product. But I'm also recommending you don't go it alone. Don't just sit there and say, gee, I've got this product. I think I'll set up an e-platform. Don't do that. To begin with, you talk to the American Chambers of Commerce, like Bill said, either AmCham China in Beijing, AmCham Shanghai, or you have AmCham South China, Guangzhou. I mean, you have expertise there. What you also have is you have law firms, you have accounting firms, you have other resources you can tap. And to begin with, the most important resource of all is the Foreign Commercial Service with the U.S. Commerce Department. They can be extremely helpful. And I know at AmCham, we work very, very closely with them. And we also referred a lot of people to them. We also have individual consulting firms who are members of the Chambers of Commerce in China. Those people are boots on the ground. They've been there for years. They know the ropes. And it all comes back to networks and guanxi. Guanxi is who you know, how you know. Please don't make the mistake that I know my family has a relative who does this, and that relative can help me. And every incident of that the company goes belly up. They get in a lot of legal trouble. Don't use people who know people who know people. Use professional resources for that. And finally, I mean, it requires a lot of time, money, adaptability to be successful in China, and it also offers continuing what that product may be. You can't just go in with one product. That'll be yesterday's product by tomorrow, and it's not going to work. You heard Richard talk about the different cuts of meat all the time, and then there'll be packaging. And Richard is going to go through, I know, has gone through a lot, and what he could, possibly be doing that. So continuously advance your offering. And most important, one of the reasons you don't go it alone, and Richard touched upon it, it's cultural issues. Doing business is not the same in China as doing business other places. It can be unpredictable, and businesses like predictability. That's actually not China. China can seem a bit irrational to an outsider, or maybe even to themselves at times. And the geopolitical tensions, everything else come into play. But cultural issues, I come back to that over and over and over and over, and working with people you can trust to be able to do it. And I will end with what I think is the most important thing. It's what I call the 6 Ds in dealing with China. It's called due diligence, due diligence, due diligence. And I cannot stress that enough. So I'm sorry for taking that, but I wanted to let you know that there are options. People are successful. It's not easy. And for those of you who are going, and if we have time, since Bill has done it and I haven't done it recently, purposely, getting in and out of China is challenging to say the least right now. And the unpredictability of the COVID containment measures, despite the fact that Shanghai is opening its ports today. Anyway, with that, I'll turn it back to Rob or hand it over to Larry. Rob?
Great. Thank you, Brenda. That was excellent. So there's a ton of questions that have come in. So let's just go through them sort of one by one. But again, let's try to be as brief as possible in our responses. Yeah, just touch the button. Thank you. Again, assume these questions are being asked by a very small company who's never done anything in China before. Okay, let's start with that, and then we can build from there. Everybody has mentioned AmChams. Let's discuss that for a second. If you were a small Hawaii company, you're thinking about exporting to China, what is the first market you should look at? A city market. Should they be looking at Shanghai first, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Xi'an, Chongqing? Is there one commercial area that is easier for Hawaii companies to get to? And the Hawaii companies I'm thinking of, well, are the clothing companies, the skincare, the creams, the lotions, cosmetics, and then let's think about some of the food manufacturers like a Richard's company. Where is a first market for them to attack? Do you have any opinion on this?
I'll also turn this over to Bill. I know he's had extensive experience in that. For me, it's not choosing the city first. It's, to be honest with you, looking at where there might be a need for my product. I think it's extremely hard to break into the big cities. I would probably go out to the 2nd or 3rd tier cities. I might move out to, depending on if I thought and did my research that there was a need for the product, going to places like Hangzhou, Suzhou, or I would go out. I don't know. Bill, I'd like to pass it over to both you and Richard, because I'd like to know what you would think on that. But I wouldn't necessarily start with Shanghai, Beijing. I wouldn't. Richard, do you want to say? I wouldn't start. I would start where I could be successful first.
Well, really depends on the products. So, for example, for my beef business, Shanghai will be like 80% of my markets. Guangzhou will be the remaining.
Why Shanghai?
They have more high-end
more money.
restaurants. Yeah, so that will be like that. But offals there will be in Chengdu, Sichuan, and Guangdong, because they like the offals market. When we talk about tropical fish, and we go to Beijing as the biggest market. Beijing and Guangzhou will be the biggest market. And then for seafood, like when we sell to seaweed, and Fujian will be the biggest market. So it really depends on the products.
So we've mentioned AmCham several times. Which AmCham would a Hawaii company join? There's several, and now they have a program. Brendan and I have talked about this before. They have a program where you can join one, even Hong Kong, join AmCham Hong Kong, and then with a little additional fee, you get to be a member of all of the AmChams in China, even the smaller ones outside of Shanghai and Beijing and what have you. And that's something to the tune of $2,000 to $2,500 per year, which is not unreasonable, I think, for the level of access. But do you have any opinion on that?
For me, it'd be where closest to the markets you want to be in, because that's where your networks and connections would be. Bill?
Yes. The AmCham based in Beijing has branches in Tianjin and in Dalian, Shenyang, Wuhan, and now in Chengdu. So you would keep that in mind. The AmCham based in Shanghai, I know, is active in Suzhou as well, and I don't know where, in Hangzhou. And so I don't know about the program that allows you to be members of both of those, but those would be the big daddies, in my opinion. Now, Guangzhou has another AmCham, AmCham South China, which is led by a dear friend of ours, Harley Sayedin. And they're also very good. Traditionally, well, Guangzhou was more manufacturing, but everything is shifting now. So I think that Richard's advice, to the extent that you can figure out, I know this is kind of an iterative process. Well, I don't know which AmCham I want to go to because I don't know where my market is going to be until I join AmCham, and they help me find out. But I would be involved with, Shanghai tends to be more of a business center, all other things being equal. So if you were going to join one, I think that would be the one I would join. Beijing activity is more government affairs focused. Just as a rule of thumb, this is all changing and it's not in stone, but that's what I would recommend.
Okay, thank you. Let's give a quick plug, and we can talk about this for a second, but let's give a quick plug to the U.S. Commercial Services, John Holman, who is based here in Honolulu, in fact, at this facility at the Foreign Trade Zone. He would be a key window for people to approach to get access to the other consulates and in the embassies in China. So again, John Holman, Holman, and I can put his contact information in the chat later. But he's a critical component to that. Let's see. Oh, please, go ahead.
On a slightly different tangent, I have a question about exporting services. Well, we're looking at exporting services related to expertise we have here in Hawaii, which is hospitality and tourism. So perhaps exporting architectural services, civil engineering services, hospitality training, which raises a whole different set of questions about regulatory environment in China. Would it still be the commercial services and AmCham that would be the best avenues to navigate the opportunities there? And the opportunities look good. I was checking out, China alone has 440 hotel development projects on the books for 2023, and that's 2/3 of all rooms projected for the region. But I also know that it's not easy to enter that market, especially in the area of services.
I think that all,
Why don't you do this? And I think you might have to.
I have a mic, yeah. My experience in AmChams is that service-oriented companies are members there and network very well there. So certainly service exporters from Hawaii should be a member there. I would also give a plug to Shanghai, and just a little anecdotally, before the pandemic, there was a direct flight from Honolulu to Shanghai on China Eastern, and I was using that almost as a commuter flight to go to China frequently. When the pandemic hit, that was sort of the first one to be cut, and China Eastern stopped all activities to the US, and certainly that flight was included. I hope that that comes back quickly, because right now getting to China is not easy, but that was extremely easy to do.
Let me just add to your question, or try to answer it a little more, that the Foreign Commercial Service, this is their reason for being. This is how these officers are evaluated if they're able to help you export your service. So it is in their interest to do that. That's what they exist for. And so they have offices in Beijing and Guangzhou and Shanghai and Shenyang, the office and Wuhan. The office in Chengdu was closed in the last administration. Hopefully we'll get back there. But my point is it's nationwide, and they, they've got a little fire in their belly to make sure that you succeed. So I would definitely follow through with John Holman on that.
Great, thank you. Brenda mentioned her 6 Ds, all based on due diligence. One of the questions that's come in is, how can a Hawaii company do due diligence on a Chinese company, whether that's a customer or a potential representative, distributor, agent, even maybe an employee that you're thinking of hiring?
That's a great question. Due diligence. The 6 Ds, I love that. Going back to an earlier question about trying to figure out where to do your business, market research is so much more available now. Information is so much more available. This type of commercial information is so much more available now than it was. So a lot of it may be in Chinese, and so you may need to work with someone who can help you do some of this research here in Hawaii. But you can do so much here that it's really not the big question mark than it was before. Now this question was, repeat that. Could you repeat this?
How do you do due diligence?
Due diligence. Well, and it's related to that. That's why I mentioned the market research, because you can do a lot online, and the Foreign Commercial Service also has a service which does, I would call it cursory background check. They'll go to Dun & Bradstreet or whoever and things like that. And there are people who will do more in-depth due diligence for you, and depending on what your budget is, it's worth spending some money. You don't have to do a Pinkerton's and find out all of the skeletons in the closet of the boss of that company necessarily, although that would be nice to know. But there are services available there, and that you could get through commercial service, through AmCham. I'd be happy to help too.
Richard might have some.
Well, just my personal experience, I think most of the Chinese business owners, they really into the social medias. So using the social media to check their backgrounds, where their school they go, where they live, where their kids, and what comments they make on the, public issues and political issues. So I think that will build like a really good image of who your buyer is or who your customer is. So that way I think most of the Chinese intend to express the comments. So this are good things. So, they don't hold their tongues. So in a way, so you can dig that file and the last 4 or 5 years and what they say in Weibo, WeChats, and, you name it, all those things.
You lead me right into another good question. We first have to make it clear to the audience that social media and the internet is different in China than it is here or other places that these companies might be working in. For example, Google products are not legal in China. Facebook, Instagram, the typical American social media platforms are not legal in China. So we have to adapt to the platforms that are legal in China. You mentioned WeChat, that's certainly the biggest. WeChat is like a Twitter, but it's also a communicative. You can chat with people, which I do daily with people in China. So what is your recommendation then for a Hawaii company trying to get the market noticing their products? What should they be using in terms of social media?
Like for example, if you get in contact in Alibaba, and then the first thing they will contact you from WhatsApp. The WhatsApp is the bad part of WhatsApp is it's very high secure one-to-one platform. So you don't really understand this personalities and life cycles and that type of thing. So I strongly suggest that from the WhatsApp, and you say, hey, I want to be friend with you on WeChat, and then I want to see your Weibo, so that type of, and you build a really. Can you explain Weibo just a little bit more? Weibo is very similar to Twitter, but so especially the differences of Weibo and Twitter is that Twitter is a very short and only 144 words, and then Weibo you can be an article, can be pictures, can be anything, and then there's a lot of interacts with comments. So from the comments, and you kind of fully understand what that person is, and then someone yell to him or they have an argument on certain subjects, and then you can build this image in your mind.
And WeChat is more texting back and forth to each other. What I like about WeChat is that it has an automatic translation function. So I can translate Chinese into English, and the counterpart in China can translate English into Chinese. And so we're working pretty well together in real time.
Yeah, Weibo is WeChat.
Huh?
Yeah.
Weibo is and WeChat a difference. Yeah, a difference. Right. And then I think the WeChat for that particular function is very similar to WhatsApp, but I think you should more focus on take a look they call 朋友圈, the friend circle, what they post, where they went and where's their daily life. People most of the Chinese intend to post a lot, so. It's all those digital prints, is way more effective to do the due diligence than any lawyers.
I think we could do a whole program just of social media in China. Maybe we should work on that. Let's talk about payment from China. How do you get paid by your customers? Is it easy?
Well, that's pain. That's definitely, they always try to pay the last second. So obviously there's a cost. So they try to use a third party's money to do business. Which is understandable, but they try to always make a big commitments, and then just setback, and then the last minute, hopefully you get your pay, so you have to kind of hammer them.
But how do you get paid? Through bank wire?
Bank wire, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, bank wire, and then I don't accept LCs. LCs can be critical. In my industry, the problem is that, like, for example, we use pounds, and then the China use kilos. And then in feedlots, slaughterhouse, and then we have USDA inspections, that the scale can be a little bit off. Then they use the formula to translate to kg can be like 0.01 off, and then that certificate can be invalid. So using an LC will be super dangerous, because that 0.01 off this document is totally is invalid. Wire. So I just force them to wire him.
Mm. And payment terms are usually a prepay. Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Good for you.
Well, I don't.
recommend that.
Yeah, I don't fool around.
I would do that.
Now, how about shipping to China? Is that easy? The shipping part, I think, is easy. The importation, once it gets to the port of
Yes.
Tianjin or Shanghai, what's that like for you?
Well, the last 2 months, as you guys know, the Shanghai port is totally shut down. That's a huge issue. I get 4 containers in Shanghai port, and they've been stuck for like a month and a half. Only the fees will be, like 10 grand each, per container, just for the waiting to offload.
Well, how about, we all know that there's problems now,
Yeah.
but in normal time,
In normal time, it's very
pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Can I ask, what about the customs regulations on importing food and having, whichever port you're using, and having to deal with their equivalent in the city of FDA and getting past customs?
Yeah, we work with USDA quite often. Like almost every shipments. Right now, the 2 country system sometimes is off. So we have one particular case is that we have the USDA certificate by paperwork. But when we send to China, and then it was not into the USDA system. So in a way, that shipment, and then the China raised the flag and say, hey, this document can be fake. So we have to call the USDA office in Beijing, embassy, and try to, and then they realize, and the officer here, and forget to input into the system. So in that particular case, if in LC, this shipment is totally done, so.
Okay. As Bill Zarrett mentioned in his excellent talk, I think it's hard to do business in China and divorce yourself completely from the politics of the situation. There's too much going on with restrictions on doing business in China or other markets you may work in. So let's talk for just a minute about Taiwan. There was a question about, can I do business in Taiwan and do business in China? And could that change in the future? Do you have an opinion about that?
I don't see there's any issues in there. Just believe the silent majority. So a lot of the public Chinese, they may not say anything on the political issues, but it doesn't mean they totally agree on what the government say. So I don't see there's any issues on that.
Yeah, and I don't think it would affect any of our exporters here. But obviously, if there are any high-tech items that have national security, it would be, folks would be watching very closely on that. And companies that are involved in defense are on many of them are on a list blacklist in China, like the Damocles sword. Nothing's been done yet, but at any moment. But again, for our exporters, I agree with you, Richard. I think it's fine.
Okay, Brenda, do you have an opinion on that?
I would agree.
Okay, and then where does Hong Kong fit in now? Okay, earlier in my career, a lot of American companies would go to Hong Kong first and use Hong Kong as kind of a jumping board, springboard into the China market. I don't think that that's true anymore. It's not a necessary step anyway. A lot of American companies can go right to Shanghai because, as Brenda mentioned before, the WOFE, or the wholly owned foreign entity, exists now. It used to be that was very difficult for a foreign company to own 100% of a subsidiary in China, but now it's actually quite straightforward. So do you have an opinion about Hong Kong and where that fits?
I would agree with what you said, Rob. Also, it depends on the market, the industry, and quite frankly, it depends on your business model. And once you choose your business model, then where are the best partners to help you implement that business model? And it might be in Hong Kong, or in my experience, most people wanted to go direct into China because they could now, and the Chinese appreciated that. They want to know who they're dealing with also.
But I would say for our Hawaii companies, certainly Hong Kong and Macau have money, and there may be products that are successful just in those markets alone. Okay. Let's ask Larry a couple questions, if we can, on trademarks and intellectual property, which I know Larry knows a lot about. We get many questions dealing with exporting anywhere in the world. What should we be doing on intellectual property and what have you? But what's particular about China that Hawaii companies need to look out for?
I'm not sure if it's particular to China, but your number one thing to do is protect your intellectual property. And you do that if you have a trademark, you register your trademark. Other ways, other kinds of things that you're doing. You need to, there's some agents in China who are relatively inexpensive, and they can register your marks and everything, but you need to do that. That won't protect you totally from piracy, but it's a good first step.
There are local attorneys in Hawaii who can help with that. You don't have to directly go to a lawyer in China.
Yes, there's one or two lawyers. I'm thinking of one in particular. He has a good friend in China, and she does all of his intellectual property registration for his clients.
Okay. Well, I have a question. This is for a client of mine. I have some personal experience with this lately. Let's say that the name of your company is Example, and you use .com as your main window to the world purposes and what have you. Somebody in China registers example.com.cn or example.cn just so that you can't use it or whatever the reason. How do you get control of that? Do you have an opinion on that?
I used to have an opinion on it, but cyber squatters. It's a very lucrative business around the world. So they squat on these names, and you have a company, you're building a brand. Somebody from wherever comes through and says, "Oh, I like that brand. I'm gonna register that trademark in X country," and I know sometime they're going to come to my country and try to set up something, and I will be happy to sell them the trademark. So it's a business model.
Okay. Let's see. We talked a little bit about e-commerce earlier, Brenda. Richard, I suspect you're not selling beef on Alibaba.com or of course, but a lot of our Hawaii companies have become used to Amazon.com.jp and selling products in Japan. Is there anything like that in China? Is there an Amazon.com China? I already know the answer is no, but is there a analogous version of that our companies could sell on in China?
I'll give it to Richard. He was talking about JD, and I talked about Taobao.
Yeah, Taobao would be a little bit like a lower end products, and then JD, Jingdong.com. So they have their own distributions. I think some of the Hawaii suppliers can contact them directly, and they more very similar to Amazon's. They have their central warehousing, so you don't need to worry about anything, and then just ship it to them.
So you
and then
pre-position product there?
Yes, very similar to Amazon.
Okay.
And just this goes to Larry's expertise. It's difficult to control folks knocking off your product and selling on these platforms. I know that Chinese practitioners are trying to address that, but it's an issue if you do sell online.
Great. Let's talk just very briefly, because we've mentioned e-commerce, we've mentioned social media, your websites, etc. But I think some of our local companies might be surprised to learn that there's actually different types of Chinese language, meaning China simplified Chinese versus Taiwan traditional Chinese, and you cannot build one sort of Chinese model, that there has to be some subdivisions of that depending on what market you're trying to attack. So I'm just curious, do you have any opinion on that? How a company can internally market itself using the different Chinese, and when I say different Chinese, it's more different than British versus American English, right? So do you have some opinions about that?
Yeah, so there's sort of two areas there. One is written language and spoken language. So written language, the Taiwan still uses what's called the traditional script, and more strokes to the character. And PRC some years ago simplified their characters, and it's called simplified Chinese. So I would not use simplified in Taiwan. I wouldn't use traditional in back and forth. So you have to be careful on that. Spoken language is far more complicated. Cantonese, spoken Cantonese is unintelligible to a Beijing speaker. And so if you're going to be working in Hong Kong or Guangzhou, then your material should be in Cantonese. If you're going to go up north, then Mandarin or these local, they're really different languages. They're derived from each other, but they're different languages and mutually unintelligible. So you have to, if you find a market, you need to be able to write material in that language. I'm not sure this is an example directly on point, but when I was working in China at a Chinese international law firm, a bank from Hong Kong wanted to open up an office in China, so they had to go through the regulatory process. And one of our partners at the firm, that's what he did. So they submitted their materials to us. Their Chinese language material was awful. They couldn't speak Mandarin Chinese. Their English materials were awful. Their Cantonese materials, I can't speak for that because I don't speak Cantonese. But this is an issue that the Chinese themselves face as they go around.
Yeah, I only bring up the topic just to make our audience aware that there is a big difference between the languages, and that just by saying, with air quotes, Chinese, that it's much more complicated than that, and just to be careful. Let's see, a question came in about, maybe Richard can best address this. Hawaii companies excel at the organic products, natural based products. Is there a growing market in China for these types of products? Knowing that they're more expensive, we understand that.
Yeah, that definitely is, but I will suggest whoever in that industry that the certification need to be super legit, because there's a lot of claim organic products in China itself. So in order to really make sure your product is, distinguished from that kind of product, so you're do as extra certification, not just just like our products we do have we call it rectampanium free. We also have Europe standards, EU standards products, and most of the Chinese, there's a law system difference. The Chinese doesn't believe it. Like for us is that even you're a suspect criminal, and until they prove you're still innocent. But the Chinese system is that you're a criminal until you prove yourself as innocent. So they kind of always suspect that. So that's why you need to do a lot of extra work. We do sell EU standard products, which is non-hormones, antibiotics products in China, and we sell really expensive, on that products. But we do a lot of certification.
Is there any cooperation between the USDA and the Chinese counterpart, so that if a Chinese customer sees USDA certified organic, does that mean anything in China?
They do. USDA, definitely do a great job, but we need to educate the customers. Like I give you extreme examples that I have a call from Chinese buyers, and then they say they can find their own cattle, and then they can kill at a home-based slaughterhouse, and then they want to repackage in our slaughterhouse, which is USDA certified, and then to sell it. I told them, I said, that's totally illegal. Like all of us will be in jail, and they don't understand that. They say, oh, it happened in China. So things like that you need to be, address. Like we have to find the laws and then address that and show it to them and say, hey, this can be super extreme, case, So, yeah.
Larry's got, I'll let you go.
Yeah, just a comment on organic. When we were living in China, I guess it's been, 8 years ago we left China. Seems like a long time ago. But the organic craze was just getting off the ground. Everybody wanted something organic. The local farmers figured out very early on it's cheaper to print the word organic on a sticker than it is to grow something organically. So you have to be careful about that.
And I think it's also really, underscoring what Richard said, it's really important to have work together with USDA, also the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is actually the biggest exporter, I think, for the United States, and work together with them and their counterparts in China in the various ministries. Now, whether they're talking or not, I don't know. And as Larry said, it's very easy to print a label in China. But if you can at least get through some of the channels for organic, it's, for organic or healthcare products. Plus, China has its own rules, regulations, and laws now on that make it extremely difficult sometimes to jump those regulatory hurdles to get your product in, even though it's totally certified in the U.S. So this is where agencies working together or having some sort of partnership or working, with the Foreign Commercial Service or the agricultural people from U.S. Department of Ag were also at the consulates and embassy. And I would always touch bases with them and have our companies also touch bases with them because they also know who their counterparts are in the Chinese government agencies. And if they're talking, and I put that as a caveat primarily because of the geopolitical tensions, then it's important that they can help speed that process because there will be stamps. The Chinese have their own stamp, and the Chinese have to approve it. We can't just say it's ours, take it in. The Chinese will say, well, that's nice, but I don't know it's yours, because they know they print things all the time.
I suppose that I'm sure the Hawaii Department of Agriculture can help too. that group there, Sharon and Yukashi, and helpful in this regard as well. Okay, all of the questions are basically answered, I believe. Let me double check online if there's any questions. I'm going to read this question verbatim. Just bear with me a second. We understand your focus is on export to China, but do you know of resources or forums like this to help us as a local small business to work with China manufacturers? Essentially, this has more to do with bringing stuff to the U.S., but then also we design and sell our but would eventually like to export. So is there anything locally here? I suspect the foreign trade zone can help with that where we're at right now at Pier 2, foreign trade zone number 9. You can find information at ftz9.org. They would have some expertise about bringing things in from China. Do you have any opinions about that? For eventual re-export.
They don't need help finding a manufacturer. They need help in finding an importer. Is that?
Yeah, and they're nervous about supply chain issues, and I think prior to the pandemic, things were going relatively smoothly, but now things are up in the air. And are there other options available?
Well, what we find with folks that have been active in Beijing for a long time is that they're diversifying their supply chains, something they should have been doing all along, and they're doing that now. More and more companies are doing that, and so not relying necessarily on just China for their source of their goods. Maybe they might want to go someplace else in Southeast Asia or someplace in Latin America. I don't know. A lot of companies are going to India. A lot of companies are going to Southeast Asia. And this may be much more of a move than this questioner has in mind, but it's something to keep in mind because the folks that have so much experience with China are seeing the weaknesses in the supply chain, and it's not just COVID. A lot of it is, well, based on geopolitical. And something that I think is worth pointing out, again, going back to what the members say about doing business, the AmCham members say about doing business in China, for the last few years, the biggest single challenge for these people is the U.S.-China relationship. And when at one point it might have been IP issues, or other things on the list, rising labor costs and regulatory compliance and so forth. Number one is the relationship. So as you're going forward with these, should I find a different manufacturer or these issues that Richard and especially Brenda have been talking about, the nitty-gritty issues. Also to keep in mind that we have to watch what's happening with the relationship because it's going to be important in the future for where you're going to get your products.
Well, I agree completely. It cannot be ignored as much as we would like to. Say you're doing business in Japan or Korea or Brazil or whatever. You don't have to think very much about these bigger macro issues of the relationship between your government and the foreign government. But I think with China, it simply can't be ignored because it could change on a dime and things obstruct your daily business activity there. I think we should start the process of wrapping up. I'd like to just ask each of you, and Bill, maybe you just did it, but I'd like each of you to just give us one final comment. Again, thinking about small companies from Hawaii, what's one thing that they can do today to start moving forward with doing business in China?
I get 2 bites at the apple. Listen to what each one of us has said today. It's challenging. It's unless you're, well, China's the biggest growing market that there is, depending on which product. So as Brenda especially emphasized, it's doable. It takes a lot of work. Just talk to Richard. But it's doable. So make sure you have the right folks helping you and doing your market research and your due diligence.
Well, to all the Hawaii exporters, and if you need help, I'm always there. I have a small office in China, so I can help for, if you want to source something, if you need help, I can do things for you guys too.
I'll put in the plug for the Hawaii Pacific Export Council for all of our members who have extensive experience in international business and exporting. Also, it's important to look at what the business plans are going to be developed, know your business model, but call Rob over at HPEC or the current chair or vice chair, but call them. Also talk to the Foreign Commercial Service at John Holman, and he can also contact any one of us because he knows all of us who've been appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to volunteer our time to work with exporters. So definitely HPEC and FCS.
I'll come back to intellectual property. You don't have to look further than your neighbor to know you need to protect your intellectual property. If you're doing various kinds of Hawaiian products, if you go to the fairs here in Hawaii, everybody has a cell phone. They're all taking pictures of all the products because they're going to take it back to your next door neighbor, and they're going to start making your product cheaper and selling it. So even if you're just going to stay here in Hawaii, do something to protect your intellectual property.
Great. All right, with that, I'd like to wrap this up and say thank you very much to Bill Zarrett, Senior Counselor at the Cohen Group. Thank you very much for being here and your wonderful overview. Richard Chie from the HSL Group, thank you so much. Brenda from Foster and Associates, and Larry, who I guess is one of the associates, but former Dean of the and Professor Emeritus of the UH Law School. This was our first event in over 2 years to be kind of hybrid here, where we have a live audience at the Foreign Trade Zone, and then we have our online audience who's been very patient with us the past couple of years that all of our events have been online. So to them, thank you. And we will try going forward to have more of these events as hybrids, and we will certainly be doing more China events as well as other topic-specific or country-specific events in the future. So with that, thank you very much. Look for this video in about a week to be posted to our YouTube archive. This is Rob Hack with the Hawaii Pacific Export Council signing off today. Aloha to everyone, and thank you again for joining.